Uh, I'm Pramit Chaudhuri, fellow at the Ananta Aspen Center and foreign editor of the Hindustan Times. Today I'm hosting a webinar titled China's Place in the Post-COVID-19 World Order. As most of us know, the pandemic originated from China. The nature of the virus is still under some debate. But there's a fairly wide set of views already as to what will happen, what the world will look like after the pandemic is over or under control. Some argue the world will be more or less the way it was before the pandemic, with a few minor changes here and there. Others argue it will be fundamentally different in many ways. And I think one country definitely will be whose own behavior both during and I suspect after the pandemic is going to be considerably different. It will be China itself. China was already had a fairly strong sense of, should we say, destiny before the pandemic. Since then, we've seen China act and treat various countries in different ways. But one, it's been both defensive about and apologetic about what being the source of the virus, but it also been extremely aggressive in its behavior, both in terms of continuing its attempts to control the South China Sea, its responses to the relationship with the United States, which have deteriorated considerably, but also, for example, its remarkable aggression and rhetorical aggression to countries like Australia or to Europe in general. However, China has been remarkably benign in many ways. But to discuss all of this and to get a sense of what China thinks about this and how India and other countries might respond, I have an extremely distinguished panel, starting with Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, who served as our envoy to Beijing and is presently a distinguished professor at the Symbiosis International University. General Narasimhan, Lieutenant General Narasimhan, who is on the National Security Advisory Board and the head of the Center for Contemporary China Studies, and Sivasamban, who is Vice President Global Corporate Affairs of Tata Sons. So let me begin with you, Ambassador. Give us a sense of where you see China fitting now in the present international system, given what the pandemic has both left and continues to do in its wake.
Thank you, Pramit. And let me just lay out two broad brush strokes, and perhaps later we can get to it. But let me just lay out very broad terms how I visualize a post-COVID-19 world order, particularly talk about China's place in it. But I'm afraid my first point has to do with the United States. And I think all of us will agree that that is very important, talking about the new world. As we have seen during the course of even combating this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, the US will, I believe, continue to turn further inward to resolve its own issues and problems at home. We have seen that there were issues and problems at home in the United States even before the pandemic. These seem to have got amplified during the pandemic. And I think this process has just got accelerated as a result of the pandemic. Point number two, China's image has definitely taken a beating as a result of the pandemic. And I must say that, you know, even these wolf warriors, as we have been describing them, have not really been helping China in changing the narrative. Civil societies across the globe are very upset with China. And I think that is a very important objective fact which the post-COVID world will have to deal with. Point number three is that the tensions between the United States and China have only grown as a result of the pandemic and have not deteriorated or not declined. And therefore, this will continue to be one of the defining features of post-COVID world. Point number four, the United Nations and organizations, including, as we have seen, the WHO, will be brought to a kind of standstill where work is concerned because of this US-China rivalry and tension. What will therefore happen, Pramit, in my view, is that this will open some space for a group of middle powers. There will be certain middle powers, perhaps Japan, perhaps France, perhaps India, perhaps South Africa, for a group of such middle powers to take global leadership on the current issues which animate humanity and need urgent solutions, such as the pandemic itself or even global warming. So there will be space for this. And my last and final point, and I'll stop there, is that the way I India-China relations developing post-pandemic is that they have always been very complex. I believe they will be even more complex or complicated in the post-pandemic world and will require careful and sensitive handling by both governments in Delhi and Beijing. So this is how I view a post-COVID world, including China's place in it, but we can go into greater details later. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Before I turn to General Narasimhan, for everybody who's on the audience out there, remember that if you're on Zoom, if you go to the Q&A, the Q&A pointer at the bottom of the screen, you can send us questions. We will look at it halfway near the end of the session. And if you're on Facebook, you can also message us and send us Facebook messages and questions for us to look at. General Narasimhan, where I'd like to look to some degree where you think China's thinking about all of this, as well as look at some of India's responses.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Let me first thank Pramit and Ananta for giving me an opportunity to express my views on China post-COVID. Most of it is going to depend on how internally China shapes up first. And in that, if you look at it, after the initial hiccups of handling the COVID, later on when they handled the COVID scenario, it became much more effective. So to that extent, there was some kind of efficiency which came in. Second thing is on the issue of the delay in conveying to the people, which has created a lot of heartburn against China. And that is something that is going to play out over a period of time, which Ambassador Bambawale also mentioned a little while ago. Third is there was a question whether this has eroded the Chinese Communist Party's position, whether it has eroded Xi Jinping's standing. Our own understanding and reading after a lot of studies is that, yes, there was some criticism in all parts of the society, including academics, business people, students, social activists, everybody had something to say. However, there's no critical mass that we see that could change the shape of China's Communist Party or Xi Jinping's position as it stands today. Fourth point is on the centenary goal of 2021. Will it get affected in some form or the other? My reading is that as far as the international organizations go, the influence has increased, which was one of the prerequisites. The second prerequisite was to increase the GDP part, and that GDP part may get affected a little bit. However, they will generally go ahead and announce that these goals have been achieved. As far as 2049 goals are concerned, I don't think there will be a major change or major effect that will be caused because of COVID-19. As far as the defense field is concerned, if you look at how the Chinese companies went back to manufacturing, it is the defense industries which went back first to manufacturing. So as far as, and if you look at the number of ships that are getting launched, if you look at the number of production units that have gone online, we find that there's no change if defense manufacturing part is concerned. The second thing is on the budget. There has been a lot of saying that defense budget could affect defense budget of China could get affected. Therefore, the defense manufacturing, etc., will get affected. At least I see no reason why this is going to happen. The way they have been going and launching and commissioning ships, I don't see there is a reduction happening even in the defense budget part of it. In the international relations part of it, Ambassador Bambawale talked about the backlash that China is facing. And in addition to that, we also get to see a pretty aggressive behavior in South China Sea, off the coast of Vietnam, off the coast of Malaysia, off the coast of Philippines and Indonesia. You find all these 4 states being pushed actually on the South China Sea front. And that got escalated with the US ships and the Australian ship getting deployed there to compound this particular situation. So this aggressive behavior has not been affected because of COVID. So I expect that this behavior will continue to happen in South China Sea. As far as US-China, I will not cover because Ambassador Bambawale has covered it. On the EU-China relations are concerned, you find a divided response to China. There are certain countries which actually have been on the side of China through this, and there are certain countries which have been opposite to China. You find this kind of a fissure which in European Union is likely to continue over a period of time when China tries to push its relationship with the European Union. However, the technological acquisitions are likely to get delayed because there is a technological denial kind of an effort that comes up in all these issues. In the India's neighborhood, China has behaved as expected. It favored the countries which are close to it, like Pakistan, and to some extent, other countries like Nepal. However, it has not been able to make a major push into the region. So therefore, you will find the influence of China and its efforts to push her influence in the India's neighborhood is likely to continue post-COVID. China-Russia relations have been on track as it was there earlier. There was some disagreement on the people being brought back to China from Russia, etc. Russia closing the borders, etc. But I think that is not a very serious issue. As far as the economy is concerned, on the business front, I am sure Mr. Sivasamban will continue to say on this. The only thing I want to say is the GDP growth, which has been projected by IMF, is around 1.2% for China this year. But next year, expect a 9.2% year-on-year increase. So which, when you average this out, approximately it will land up with a 4% to 5% growth of GDP for the next year, both years put together. So you find that the major differences are not going to happen, at least in the near future. Job losses is something that China has to handle. It will face a problem there. The financial markets in China have been stable. So that is something that is a positive at this moment. As far as the supply chains, etc. are concerned, you find the yuan internalization process is on. They launched the pilot project on digital currency and electronic payments on 1st of May in 4 of the cities as a pilot project. So that project has gone on. Oil prices were low, and so they were filling up a lot of their strategic reserves, etc., as taking this opportunity. Again, that will stand them in good stead when the oil prices come back to normal. And you find 6 months down the line, the view of the countries may change a bit, basically because all the countries will be expecting to reboot their economy. And one country which can help them to do that will be China. So to some extent, you will find that there will be a little change, a shift in the stance of the countries 6 months to 1 year down the line. I'll stop there and I'll take on further things in the question and answer session.
Thank you, General. Before I turn to Shiva, I'll just mention that this has been the 6th webinar hosted by the Ananta Aspen Center since the lockdown began. And we will be holding many more, including on-phone issues. In fact, our next one will be later this week, which will be on Africa, a continent that it will be in, if it was already in geopolitical play before the pandemic, and be even more so afterwards. So Shiva, as I turn to you now, looking at it on the two sides, the technology and the business side, we have seen that, for example, 5G, the battle over 5G has continued unrelenting throughout the pandemic, with European countries in particular coming back and forth on this, Britain eventually opting out, Germany opting in, China still pressing this, on a whole bunch of, in fact, anything digital is now even more important, given the experiences of the pandemic, and obviously afterwards will be there. And as a general mention, the return of the economy, how fast you get back on your feet is going to be absolutely crucial in the post-pandemic world.
No, thank you, Pramit, and good morning, General Narasimhan and Ambassador, and good morning to everybody else, everybody on the call. Whether China can maintain its position in the global economy or ends up isolated. Will there be new emerging economic blocks? Will there be new supply chain reorientation going forward post-COVID? Or items that I would assume that we will be discussing for a while in the days to come. Surely, as the ambassador said, there has been a dent to China's image, and therefore potentially could be an opportunity for us. I'm sure the government of India will look at all mechanisms such as the economic, fiscal, FDI, and other enablements that is required for us to attract investments into the country. However, in the short run or immediate term, like the Lieutenant General said, we need to be wary of some facts. The fact is that China is a $14 trillion economy today, 14 plus. The analyst estimates vary from anywhere from 0.8 to 2% GDP growth in the coming year. And next year again varies from anywhere from 8 to 9.5%. But even if you were to take, let's say, a 1% growth in the GDP in the coming year in absolute terms, no other country is going to add about $140 billion. Until there is a reorientation that happens, the reality is China will continue to be the factory for the world across many sectors, I would assume. Something that we should not lose sight of. And the fact that it's got a fairly large local market as well. Already, if you look at the Q1 numbers, ASEAN has emerged as a bigger trading partner for China than EU. So what does it mean into the immediate term future? One will need to wait and see. From an India viewpoint, the reality is that China is the largest trading partner. And many of our intermediaries, we depend on China today. So until there is a reorientation that happens, I would also want to believe that in the immediate term, there is not going to be much of a change. Yes, there is an impact, as I said earlier. China recognizes, I would want to believe, based on whatever that we have heard from the ground, is that they are thinking in terms of building a robust and resilient economic, political, institutional, and industrial framework to ensuring that they not only grow, but also take care of any of the backlash that is potentially expected in the immediate term. Talking about technology, Pramit, specifically, I would want to believe that the 5G rollout in the European world from China might be, if not permanently, temporarily halted for sure. Having said that, within China, one can expect that, or in the friendly countries, one can expect that the rollout will happen. In fact, within China, the 5G rollout will catch up speed, in my view. The dependence on technology is only going to increase. So if at all, from a technology viewpoint, the roadmap that China had for 2025, I'll not be surprised if it gets forwarded to maybe 2023 as well, in terms of not just the 5G, but also all of the digital technologies, all of them working together. So I'll stop there as my introductory comment, and as we get into the details, maybe we can elaborate on it.
Well, just turn to you, Ambassador. You had mentioned that the accelerating or deepening cleavage between the U.S. and China would give India potentially more maneuver. How do you see that? Where are the areas we get something more out of this? And second, how do we handle the fact that if the cleavage does get worse, eventually there will be cases where either country will say, it's either my side or the other side, you choose where you want to.
Yeah. No, that's a very good question, Pramit. I understand where it's coming from. What I mean to say is that, in this battle for supremacy between the number one economy in the world and the number two economy in the world, most of our international institutions have come to a standstill. And one prime example, which all of us have seen during the past few months, is the World Health Organization. If something has to move, then it will have to be a group of middle powers and I mean a group, a coalition of middle powers like Japan, India, perhaps France, Germany, South Africa, who will have to take the lead in convincing both the important powers, including the US and China, about which direction to go in. That's point number one. Point number two is, I think on the economic side, this desire to broad-base production out of China is something that the rest of Asia is going to benefit from, and which I believe that even though we have a hard sell, I think India can also benefit from the move of companies, international firms out of China and into other countries. I can tell you that, you know, the government of Maharashtra, for example, and the government of Karnataka, both of whom I work with, are quite ready in their plans to do so. But I believe that the government of India should provide a lead to the state governments, who can then, of course, compete with each other in getting this kind of investment. I think that's a direction in which we need to be going in. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but these are some of my views on the issues that you raised, Pramit.
General, one of the things that I think when you look at the topic today, is the issue of China's place. Now, you mentioned seen a sharp drop in their international standing. I think Reuters just issued a story that one of their major think tanks in Shanghai has done an internal security study that says prepare for this sort of equivalent to the post-Tiananmen Square a backlash on the international side. But on the other hand, between the fact that a lot of countries need Chinese finance, they need Chinese infrastructure, and if China's economy roars back, as you mentioned, they come in with 9% or an average of 4% out of the pandemic growth. They will be far ahead of almost any Western country, potentially well ahead of India, depending on how well we react. And that will more than compensate. Ultimately, money does talk. Where do you see that going? And second, I'd like to ask you, as I've mentioned earlier, China has been aggressive, blown hot and cold to different countries during this crisis. Why have they done that? And why have they been relatively benign about it?
This is a CICIR study that you're talking about, which the Reuters put out yesterday. But if you look at that story, actually there's no confirmation from anybody. CICIR didn't confirm, anybody else didn't confirm, they didn't see the report. So I'm not really sure as to how much of truth is there in that report, which said that an equivalent of a post-Tiananmen reaction is what they are expecting. But like Ambassador Bambawale also said earlier, but there are a lot of countries which are disappointed or in disagreement with the way that China handled this particular issue. They all felt probably that China should have intimated the WHO and the world about this pandemic a little earlier. Things could have been much different. So to that extent, that is one. The second aspect is on the economic downside to COVID. Most of the countries have stopped their production for a period of time. They are going to take some more time to catch up. And what has happened is China has had the first mover advantage of starting the manufacturing first. However, they may go on the supply side strong, but the demand side shock, they'll have to absorb at some point in time. So what is happening over a period of time is there is a downside to the China's image, which has happened because of COVID. There's no denial about that. The question that comes up is how far and how long is it going to continue? And that is where we need to actually keep studying how things develop. One of the indicators is that when you read certain articles which come out of European Union, etc., they are still looking for investments to come in from China in some form or the other. Combined with the fact that European Union itself is divided plus 17 plus 1 on one side, plus the others on the other side, even within the Western Europe, differing views on how to deal with China, you find that there is a evolving trend that we need to watch as to how this is going to develop. So I am not willing to put my bet to say that everything will go against China. I don't think that is going to happen. At some point in time, the countries will adjust on the real politics of the whole thing, in the sense that I need money. If somebody can give money, I'll adjust. But that is not going to be the same case with probably US-China relations. And that is going to be basically because of various other factors. Even today, they have tried to put together a group of countries which could probably diversify the supply chain from China. That is more easily said than done. Supply chains can't shift overnight. It is going to take time. You have to create capacities within the country. You have to create technological know-how within the country. All these things are not going to happen overnight. So it is going to take time. So if you look at it, in the short run, I find that no major disadvantage will accrue to China over a period of time. The second question is on the aggressive behavior. The aggressive behavior it is not a new phenomenon. The phenomenon started truly from the 2001 spy plane incident that happened in Hainan. And from then onwards, even during Mr. Hu Jintao's time, you find the aggressive behavior of China has been increasing. And this is not something which is new. But after COVID had stuck, people would have expected a little less aggressive behavior. And that did not happen. Actually, the aggressive behavior continued, and in some places it has actually increased. And so therefore, you find this kind of a push, aggressive behavior on South China Sea and East China Sea, etc., is going to continue. Similarly, you also find this wolf warrior kind of diplomacy that goes on, with everybody going on an offensive mode. And I think they seem to have taken the lesson that offensive is the best form of defense. So therefore, they seem to be going on the defensive so that they can defend themselves. So this is something which has not gone down well, because this is beyond all diplomatic norms that we have been seeing so far. This is a new trend that has come in, and many of the countries have reacted adversely to it. So this is something that is going to play not so well for China. So this is going to add to one of the factors that countries are going to hold against China. But how far they will hold it against is a big question. That is where I'll stop.
Shiva, do you see this? How important do you think will the degree of economic bounce that follows the pandemic, how important will that be in the corporate world? That's going to be the influential voice. And perhaps I'd also like you to touch on the issue of India's decision to move China's FDI off the automatic route, and add a screening process to that.
Sure. No, I think your second question first, the decision for the FDI amendment to take away the automatic investment from a China viewpoint, to the best of my understanding, was during and the immediate aftermath of COVID, such that there is no aggressive or an hostile takeover. Long term, in my view, I don't think there has been any policy announcement in terms of Chinese investments in India. I would want to believe that outside of the core sectors, the government of India would welcome such an investment. So that's an answer to your first question, the second question, Pramit. Coming back to the business opening up, I think China, as I said earlier, is an extremely important market and a source of supply for Indian industries. So therefore, in the immediate term, I would want to believe that nothing will change between India and China from a point of view of the trade relationship that exists, or in terms of the businesses that we do. Yes, there are larger ramifications. Like I said earlier, is there going to be a global reorientation? Perhaps yes, but that's going to take some time. The supply chain reorientation is going to take some time, because one has to build those infrastructure, the capacities, etc., all of which will take time. One can expedite, as Ambassador said, and after General Narasimhan said, Government of India can expedite. Maybe what can happen in a couple of years can be pushed into 1 year, but then the reality is it's going to take 1 year. And then we have the responsibility to ensuring that in the next 1 year, our economy is up and running. The fact is also that China's reliance on exports is going to be impacted in the immediate term. I think they also recognize that, because it's a largely demand and export-driven economy. Demand, there is a contraction today. I think General Narasimhan spoke about it, but then the government there has taken series of steps to ensuring that the demand issue is addressed. But the export is going to be an issue for them in the immediate and the short term. But from a business in India point of view, you take the pharma industry from it. I don't think our reliance on China is going to come down anytime soon from an API point of view. Do we have to build alternates? Of course we have to, and we will over a period of time, because that's clearly a de-risking mechanism that one will look at as we move in, as we go into the future. Similarly, the automotive industry or the solar industry, you go into sector by sector, there is a fairly high reliance on China. So therefore, it's in our own interest, in my view, at least in the short run, that we look at China as, it's been a difficult relationship, notwithstanding that our trade has grown. Businesses have grown between the two countries. I would want to believe that the Indian businesses will want to continue that way until there are alternates.
Thank you. Let me start to turn now to some of the questions that we're starting to get from our audience. These right now, this lot are open up to anybody who wishes to respond to them. First, which I think we've already covered to some degree, how likely, and this is from Ashutosh Shastri from Enerstrat Consulting, how likely is China to buy its way back into the international system, especially given especially in the case of the European Union, which will be probably one of the worst affected parts of the world by the post-pandemic position. And related to that, he's asked, what are the prospects now for the internationalization of the renminbi? I leave that open to anybody who wishes to answer that.
Can I go, Pramit, on this?
Yeah.
On the RMB issue, I'll try and cover it first, and I also talk about the buying back of the international organizations a little bit. Then I'll request Ambassador Bambawale can further expand this. The international RMB issue is not a new one. They started saying somewhere around 2005, 2006 that they will make yuan fully convertible in 2021. When the international financial crisis in 2008 took place, they said that there is a necessity to look at an alternative for the greenback. 2016, they went into the strategic drawing reserves of the IMF. Today, they are the fourth largest holders of that SDR reserves of $217 billion, and it is growing every year after year. So the issue that comes up is, on the process of internalization of the yuan, they also went into the Hong Kong and made a different international yuan to have trading from the Hong Kong exchange. So they have been taking a series of measures to progressively internationalize the yuan. So that process is likely to continue. But and similarly, the digital currency launching of 1st of May is another step towards it. Now it is being done internally. Subsequently, it will get extended to external, and thereafter you will find another step being forwarded towards internationalization of the yuan. That is likely to continue, and they are, I think, right on course to go on and then make it fully convertible at some point in time. If not in 2021, as they announced it earlier, maybe a little later, whichever way it is, but the process is on. The second thing on the buying back of the international support, you found that the moment USA stopped the financial support to WHO, the first one to say that I'll pay some money is the Chinese, which they did, and they gave it in cash. So obviously, what is happening is there is an effort to actually buy back or increase the influence in the international organization slowly and steadily. But China is China and US is US. US has still got a lot more money than what China has got at this point in time. So China will take some more time to get fully to be in a position to fully influence the international organizations, but it will make an effort towards it definitely. That is my view.
Would either of the other two like to chip in on this? Or
I'll just make a quick point, Pramit, and I'll stop there because I think the questions have been answered very well by General Narasimhan. But on the internationalization of the RMB, I'll just pose a counter question to all of you, including all our listeners and viewers, that today and maybe a year from now, if you had the choice to hold US dollars or the RMB, which would choose? I think 99% of us would still hold the US dollar. So that's my answer as far as the internationalization of the RMB.
Correct. And I'll just add that if you look at the total global transaction, the renminbi is barely, I think if you remember correctly, about 3%. 2%. Over 3/4 of that is just Hong Kong, China, and Macau trade. In fact, that rendezvous is almost nothing. And we actually saw during this crisis an enormous rush, even by Chinese companies, to seek US dollars. There was actually a shortage of dollars in the Chinese corporate world because they didn't trust their own currency. They were desperately looking for dollars because a lot of their own transactions are dollars. Question from Hemant Batra. What is the significance, and this is highly specialized, what is the significance of several top Chinese companies delisting themselves from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange? What is the future of Taiwan, Hong Kong post-COVID, especially when you can look at what's happening in Hong Kong and I presume the strides that Taiwan has made on the international side with the battle over the WHO? And finally, do you think China would still be keen on large greenfield manufacturing projects in India, given the screening, the new process, a new policy that India has introduced regarding Chinese FDI? Again, it's open to anybody to respond to any of these.
Would you like to go on this, Sivasamban, or you want?
No, let me take the last one. I would want to believe that China would be keen on large greenfield opportunities in India. And unless and until it is not in one of the designated core sectors, I would want to believe that India should be equally be keen. It's not that, obviously there are mechanisms that you need to have to protect, and I would want to believe that those mechanisms would be in place. I think, as has been said before, there is going to be a change, permanent change to the world order in terms of how countries work with themselves. There will be a reorientation of sorts. Ambassador mentioned a group of middle countries coming together. So I would want to assume that yes, the India will be open for large greenfield businesses outside again of the core sector, as I said.
If I could just come in, Pramit, on the Taiwan-China question. Yes. I think the entire experience of the last 3 months and even going forward shows that it was very, very important for Taiwan as an entity, may not be as an independent country, a sovereign country, but it was very important for Taiwan to be a member of the WHO. I, for one, hope that in international organizations which are critical, like the WHO and so on, that some kind of formula like the sports formula at the Olympics and so on, where Taiwan plays as Chinese Taipei, could be worked out to include an important part of the world in such decision making. And I hope that that could come to pass. I hope that Beijing could have a much more pragmatic and practical view of participation by Taiwan and Taipei in such organizations. So that's my hope of a post-COVID world. I don't know if that will actually come true, but let's wait and see.
Okay. Does anybody have a view on these Chinese stock exchange stories? I've actually not been tracking.
Okay. Let me come for a second on that. You see, this top companies moving out of top Chinese companies moving out of Hong Kong Stock Exchange is not only related to COVID. It is pre-COVID when all this riots took place in Hong Kong and that on that extradition bill which was put up there. That is the time you found that some of the companies were moving out of China, and that is probably aggravated because of the COVID. Second thing is, if you look at the standings of the stock exchanges, Hong Kong actually helped basically because of its international standing. But over a period of time, China has been pushing Shanghai Stock Exchange and the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, which are actually just very close in value to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. So I don't think there will be a major problem in the companies moving out. They'll still trade, they'll still be in the international market. But the only thing is probably the instability of Hong Kong probably made them move their stocks from Hong Kong to elsewhere. That is the way I see it. I don't think there will be and probably if Hong Kong stabilizes subsequently, they may even come back. And in any case, the Chinese systems are supposed to be working in Hong Kong till 2047. Beyond 2047, in any case, everybody will be part of China. So that doesn't actually, there is a time delay, but otherwise I think it is not going to make any major difference.
I should also add that Hong Kong's special status, financial status with the American system is under threat. And if that were to happen, a lot of foreign companies definitely, I'm not too sure whether Chinese would find Hong Kong as a pointless place to do business. Vishnu Prakash, one of Gautam's former colleagues, he has a question. So in fact, Ambassador, I'll point this to you. You know, we've seen a number of countries, Australia, for example, has come out calling for a full investigation into the coronavirus's origins. And so what do you think of the possibility of, let's say, a Quad plus of countries of the Quad, maybe France, Germany, some Southeast Asian countries coming together on a platform and demanding an impartial multinational investigation into the outbreak?
Look, my view on this, Pramit and Vishnu, is that you know, all of us know where this pandemic started and originated. It was in Wuhan. There is no doubt about it. It is in the interest of humanity for us to actually go into how this pandemic spread across the world, etc. We don't have to blame any particular country because it could have started anywhere else. That is also a possibility. But without assistance and without the cooperation of the Chinese government and the people and government of China, such a investigation will not really move ahead. So I would think that, you know, if you look at it from a practical point of view, and if you the need to actually understand how all this happened and how it spread and what humanity can do to ensure that it doesn't happen again, it is necessary to undertake some kind of investigation. But it should not be a blame game, and we hope that China would also cooperate in such an investigation. So the terms and conditions should be such that all of us could work on it together. This is in the interests of humanity. Thank you.
Well, not too sure with the interests of the Communist Party of China, but anyway. Two questions actually, which I'll merge together here about the future of the Belt Road Initiative. As we know, there's already the G20 has called for all of its members to at least defer debt repayments for infrastructure for developing and LDC countries. China, however, exempted a lot of BRI projects from that commitment. But where is that going to go in terms of the debt financing on the BRI? And countries, particularly in Africa, I suppose, and a few other places, which have really racked up debts, which they almost certainly would never been able to pay before, but definitely after the pandemic. General, perhaps?
Oh, okay. On the One Belt, One Road initiative, I still call it One Belt, One Road. I don't call it BRI. On the One Belt, One Road initiative, what we saw in the month of January and February, when COVID was very much in strength in China, was that in 48 countries, the Chinese investment went up by $2.7 billion compared to last year. So I see no reason why this BRI funding will reduce in some form. That is one. The second thing is on the debt write-off requests that come from various countries. Pramit mentioned African countries. There are many other countries also which are looking for either a debt rescheduling or a debt write-off. Write-off, I'm sure the Chinese are not going to do. They will reschedule, that is quite possible. They will also rearrange the terms and conditions, that is possible. They will renegotiate the projects to downsize the project scope and the cost, that is possible. They have not so far gone out of even one single project, even when countries oppose. They have renegotiated, they have reduced the size of the project, they've reduced the cost of the project and then stayed on to the project. So what I feel is that the way we saw January, February, March happening and the investments in BRI countries going up by $2.7 billion compared to 2019, I find that the BRI projects will continue to be handled by China in the way they were handling it earlier. Yes, there are some rescheduling, rescoping, and reducing the cost as possible.
You know,
sure. Siva, you want to say?
No, behaviorally, I would assume that countries, in this case China, will behave the same way as any company would do. as to what the immediate priority will be to protect the market and protect the revenue. So I will agree with General Narasimhan. Nothing is going to go away in the short run.
Excellent. Okay. What will the impact of the US presidential elections in November on the relationship with China, not only I presume for the US-China relationship, but potentially even for other countries? Or just general, what will be the impact of US policy to China? My instinct is it'll be absolutely no change whatsoever. But anyway, go ahead. I'm open to other suggestions.
I think you should give the lead to Mr. Bambawale in this. I'll come in immediately after him.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you. Let me just quickly, state that obviously China has become an election issue in the United States. The election is just a few months away, especially with the economy now being in trouble as a result of the pandemic. One of the platforms on which either of the two candidates could run or both could run is to point fingers at China and to make China an issue in the election. So that is going to happen. But I think that even in the longer term, beyond the election and the election results of this November, the US-China friction is here to stay, irrespective of who wins the election. And I think we are going to be able to see that even going into next year and beyond. So I think this is something which is here to stay. I hope, as Pramit had asked earlier, that each of us, each country in the world is not asked to take sides. But I look at it in a different way, as I had said earlier in my opening remarks, that it gives scope for a group of middle powers, a coalition of middle powers, to take leadership on certain issues which are global issues and which impact humanity as a whole. So that's where I'll stop and leave it to General Narasimhan to continue. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ambassador Bambawale. See, the issue is that this is not actually related to COVID. This is pre-COVID also. There was a bipartisan agreement in US that China needs to be treated differently than what it was treated before. So the only method of dealing with China is likely to change if the presidency changes. Maybe that they will not go through the kind of measures which President Trump has gone in, but either Mr. Biden or anybody else who's coming in, obviously also will have to deal with China, maybe in a different manner. But how it affects India is, I don't think it is going to affect India in any major way, as Ambassador Bambawale also pointed out. That is basically because our issues with China are going to remain, our relationship with US is going to be remaining the same. So I don't see a major change, but there will be a change in the way that US deals with China in case the presidency changes.
This is a question from Shakti Sinha and specifically for General. Quote, in the first quarter of 2020, Chinese GDP shrank 6.8%, which means domestic demand is in trouble. Looking forward, with the global economy in free fall, it's hard to see China or India have any positive GDP growth. That said, 9% growth next year seems unachievable. I think we need to rethink our assumptions, but will these troubles make China more aggressive?
Okay. First, let me take the second part of the question. Will it make China more aggressive? Irrespective of the fact whether the GDP has lowered or increased, China's behavior has been the same and it will continue to be the same. Let us dealing this first. Second thing is when everybody announced 6.8% reduction in the GDP in the first quarter, that is with reference to 6.2% of the first quarter of last year, which implied compared to last year, the economy actually shrunk only that much more. That is one. Second thing, when the indication came that next year it will increase to 9.2%, please understand that 9.2% increase is going to be on 1.1% increase this year. It is not that it is a year-on-year increase of 9.2% that we are looking at. So basically, what we are looking at is, and the reduction of 6.8% in the first quarter is not very I would say difficult to understand. Basically, because everybody was locked in, nobody was going out to purchase anything much. Obviously, the domestic consumption will go down. What we remain to see now is starting from September, I am putting my bet even another quarter they may go for a low domestic consumption market. But starting from September onwards, how is this market going to behave is something that we need to wait and watch. My feeling is the way that they are given SOPs, they are given coupons for people to go and spend. They have given various other incentives for people to go out and spend is basically to increase the domestic consumption in the market. So let us wait and see September onwards how this market behaves, and then we will get a real handle on how this growth will take place. That is one. Second thing is the figures which have been put out by IMF and others, like Mr. Sivasamban also mentioning, it varies from 0.8% to 1.2%, or 8.5% to 9.5% is something the variation that comes up. Even if you take it an average, everybody seems to be on board that it is going to be in the same pattern. May not be too much of variation to that. So the growth patterns we'll wait and see as to how they grow. My reading is that starting September, the domestic consumption market in China will pick up, and by then the other countries also would have come out of the COVID issue. The point is, starting from 2008 till today, the Chinese export market was 40% of the GDP in 2008. Now it has come down to 17 to 19% in the GDP growth ratios. So China is not so much dependent on export as it was 10 years ago, and they are continuing to promote the domestic consumption market. So if you put all this together, I get a feeling the figures are generally okay. They should be, though there may be a variation to it, but I think it is generally okay. But the aggressive behavior has got nothing to do with this. China will continue to behave the way it was behaving earlier, and maybe in the future also.
Okay.
Sorry, just to add on to what General said, yes, indeed, there are multiple analysts who have quoted anywhere from 8 to 9.5%, 9.8% also I've seen. That is into the next year. And Q2, I would want to assume that there will be some level of resurgence in the domestic consumption. And, you look at some of the stimulus that they have undertaken, right? The social security contributions have been reduced from almost 26.5% to 5.5%. I think General mentioned about the consumption coupon. You get 10% off on everything that you buy. You get a consumption coupon. You buy an electric vehicle, there is no tax. You buy a car, you get a $1,500 US discount. So I think there are conscious attempts to making sure that the domestic consumption is, given a push. One has to wait and see, but most of if you look at Oxford Economics, for example, they look at the country from multiple parameters, and their risk assessment of China has only gone up by 0.1% across multiple parameters, whether it is local demand, supplies to forex, to politics, and so on and so forth. So one has to wait and see, but it can, analysts predict that will be anywhere from, as I said, 8 to 9.8% is what I have seen.
In fact, Shiva, I'll also send the next question to you. Chinese companies are on an acquisition spree, not only in India, but elsewhere in the world, including places like Vietnam. Is this an aggressive move to take advantage of weakness, or do you see this as a defensive move to prevent future possible economic isolation?
No, I think, it depends on how you look at the efforts in defense. The reality is China does expect a backlash in the medium to long term. And if supply chain indeed gets reoriented, they would want to have their presence. So I, for one, would want to believe that you will see increased such opportunities of China investing outside.
Okay. Well, one thing everybody is paying, that I know is very excited, a lot of popular attention, has been the fact that a number of U.S. state governments and individuals have filed cases have sued the Chinese government. And we'll see where that goes. But even a few African countries have talked about potentially nationalizing Chinese assets to compensate for the damage. Do you see this practice actually getting any traction? Not necessarily because we think China will necessarily pay money, but potentially you could result in ex parte judgments being made by US courts, triggering obviously further problems between these two countries. And do you see any country prepared to take economic action against China over the virus?
Who is this addressed to?
It's nobody, either of you. Any of you are happy to take this on.
Okay.
You seem to have a.
Would you like to take it on, Gautam? I can come in otherwise.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I want to end up with a double quote later, but that's about Chinese diplomacy. Please, General.
The basic thing that comes up is that, most of the countries have gone and said, even Indian Association of Lawyers have gone and filed a case. The US, some article mentioned $351 billion will be the claim that will be made on China. The other states have gone and lead cases. The problem is, how are they going to prove and how much time it is going to take to get all this? That is number one that we need to look at. Number two is, please understand, today it's you may say that countries may freeze assets of Chinese, but I'm sure those countries also have got assets in China. How does that then behave? So these are all not very simply just spoken in some kind of loose fashion that, these things will take place. It is going to take a lot of thinking and action to come up. I think, yes, there is a lot of heartburn on China today as to why it handled that particular issue in a particular manner. But I'm not very sure that all these cases are going to be won or they're going to have a major impact on anything at all. And please don't forget, 2002 SARS virus, till today, we don't know where it started. It is 18 years down the line. So it is all very easy to say that I'll lay this, I'll lay that, but it will be very difficult to prove, and it is going to be taking a long time and effort. In the immediate future, I don't see anything major happening on this account.
Okay, Gautam, I'll just move to you. There are a couple of quick questions. Both of them were aimed at, targeted for you. Do you think the BRICS response was adequate? Second, do you feel the US has put up an idea of an economic prosperity network in the Indo-Pacific? How do you see that? How do you see that shaping up? And finally, India has avoided being sharply critical of China over COVID. Is that a sound policy?
Yeah. So let me try answering some of those questions, all difficult questions. So I don't know if I can, actually answer them. But I think what has happened in the pandemic, this was a realization even before the pandemic, Pramit, and we all know about it, but it has accelerated as a result of the pandemic. That the difference in values between the West and China has got so accentuated that, and the belief that China would change now has been given up. And as a result of this, there are certain economic, political, and other decisions which will be made by Western countries, which will be quite different from how they have behaved in the past. And I would urge all of you to look at moves and changes taking place in the world from this dynamic, from this very basic kind of analysis. And therefore, I think that, this is what's going to happen increasingly in the West, including in Europe, definitely Western Europe, who share values of the United States and North America, Australia, and so on and so forth. And whether India is doing the right thing or not is something that we all have to wait and see. But let me end with this quote, which I have been wanting to talk about, Pramit, which is, and it's something which I have just made up. It's a quote from me, that how do you describe post-COVID diplomacy, which you're already seeing from China, and it will continue over the next year or two. So I've put it down in the following words, that China will come out swinging at the West while trying to throw carrots at the rest. So that's, I think, how I would sum it up.
So I think we're actually over time. So let me just ask, Gautam, I'll treat that as your concluding comment. Shiva, just one quick question. South Korean companies like Hyundai are thinking to replace Chinese imports with Indian capacities. Is India capable of producing such components and parts and providing the ability to be a replacement for China in these type of areas? And I'll take those as your remarks, and I'll end with the general.
No, very short answer to that, Pramit, is yes, but it's going to take some time.
Okay.
Yes,
Great.
absolutely yes.
All right. General, concluding comments from you. And
I have one. I saw one question in the list that whether Xi Jinping will be more carrying out some military adventurism against India to overcome this attention that he is getting. I don't subscribe to that view. Generally, taking on a country like India is not a very simple thing for even China to do. So he's going to think twice, thrice, 4 times, and 5 times before he does something like this. And please understand that any war, even if it is a winner, he is going to go down economically for the next 10 to 15 years. It is not something that is a very easily doable thing. Therefore, this diverting attention theory, which we call in the India-China relationship, is something that you need to consider with a lot of skepticism. That is what I would say on this. Otherwise, post-COVID, I think things are going to be a little different, but not so different to show that everything has changed. I don't see it that way. So there will be some changes economically, international relationship-wise, internally within China. There will be some changes, but those changes are not going to be drastic, is the way I feel.
Thank you.
Pramit, one last thing. I think post the COVID, not just China, I think given that there is an increased reliance on digital, my concluding remark will be, I think countries, more so India, will need to prepare for the pandemic in the cyber world.
Excellent. Thank you. I've just, I think I have to conclude there because we're one over time. And then sadly, the number of questions we have answered has actually increased during all the past half an hour. And we now have 39 other questions, which we are not unfortunately able to get to. But perhaps at some later point, we will revisit the subject because pandemics take a long time and China is going to be around for a long time. And so we will definitely be able to revisit this. And I've mentioned we will be having a webinar again this Thursday on just Africa, which is, of course, its own little battleground. So, gentlemen, thank you for all speaking and being with us today. And I thank the audience. The questions are actually still increasing, but unfortunately, we have already run out of time. So we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.